In the autumn of 1907, as panic spread through America like a disease, the United States government discovered a terrifying truth. It was powerless. While banks collapsed, crowds stormed the streets, and the stock market spiraled toward oblivion, the men in Washington had no plan, no tools, no central bank, and no idea how to stop the chain reaction that was tearing the nation's economy apart at its very foundations. And so, in a moment unmatched in American history, the nation turned not to its president, nor to Congress, but to a single private citizen, J.P. Morgan, a man with no public office, no legal authority, only wealth, influence, and a will forged from iron. What happened next was so extraordinary, so unthinkable, that for one critical week, J.P. Morgan held more real power than the entire U.S. government. He became, in effect, the central bank of the United States, and America would never be the same again. America before the storm. To understand the catastrophe of 1907, you have to understand what America was not. It was not the financial superpower we know today. It was not a nation with careful oversight, with safety nets, with regulatory frameworks designed to catch a falling economy. No. In 1907, the American banking system was a chaotic, fragmented, almost medieval patchwork of competing institutions, each operating under different rules, different philosophies, and with virtually no coordination whatsoever. There was no Federal Reserve. Let that sink in for a moment. The central institution we take for granted today, the lender of last resort, the stabilizer of markets, the entity that can inject liquidity into a frozen financial system with the stroke of a pen, it simply did not exist. Instead, America had thousands of state-chartered banks, national banks operating under loose federal guidelines, and a rapidly growing shadow banking system of trust companies that operated in the margins, largely unregulated, largely unwatched. It was a system held together not by law or institutional coordination, but by trust, by belief, by the collective faith that everyone would play fair and that markets would somehow, miraculously, regulate themselves. The government, for its part, believed this was not just acceptable, but ideal. They believed in the wisdom of the invisible hand, in the natural order of markets. Intervention, they reasoned, was dangerous. It was artificial. It distorted the pure mechanisms of supply and demand. Better to let the system find its own equilibrium, even if that meant occasional bumps along the way. This belief was not cynical. It was sincere. It was the prevailing economic orthodoxy of the age. But it was also, as events would soon prove, catastrophically naive. The rise of the trust companies into this loosely governed financial landscape came the trust companies, and they were different. They were aggressive. They were modern. They paid higher interest rates to depositors, which made them wildly popular. They invested in riskier ventures, which made them wildly profitable. And they operated with far less oversight than traditional banks, which made them wildly dangerous. The trust companies were the shadow banks of their era. They held deposits like banks. They made loans like banks, but they weren't subject to the same reserve requirements, the same examinations, the same regulatory scrutiny. They existed in a legal gray zone, and they thrived there. By 1907, these trust companies held billions of dollars in assets. They financed railroads, real estate empires, stock market speculation. They were the fuel of America's explosive industrial growth, and they were a ticking time bomb. Enter J.P. Morgan, and then there was the man himself, John Pierpont Morgan. By 1907, he was 70 years old, a towering figure in American finance, a man whose word could move markets, whose disapproval could destroy careers, whose very presence commanded a room like gravity, commands the planets. He was not just wealthy. Wealth was common enough among the robber barons of the Gilded Age. No, Morgan was something more. He was a force. He was the man who had saved the U.S. government during the gold crisis of 1895, personally arranging the gold shipments that prevented the Treasury from defaulting. He was the man who had organized the creation of U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in history. He was the man who controlled, directly or indirectly, more capital than any individual on earth. To his admirers, he was a stabilizing force, a man of vision and responsibility who understood that great wealth carried great obligation. To his critics, and there were many, he was a monopolist, a tyrant, a man who had accumulated so much power that he threatened the very foundations of democracy itself. Both views were correct. He was both savior and threat, both necessary and dangerous, and in the fall of 1907, America would discover just how much it needed him, and just how much that need would cost. The whispers begin. The first signs of trouble came quietly, the way these things always do. A speculative scheme here, a failed stock manipulation there, rising nervousness in the markets, whispers in the clubs and trading floors that perhaps, just perhaps, things were getting a bit overheated. In August, there were minor tremors. Stocks wobbled. Some of the more aggressive trust companies saw depositor withdrawals tick upward. Nothing alarming, nothing that suggested the catastrophe to come. Just the normal rhythms of a market that had been climbing for years, and was perhaps due for a small correction. The bankers and financiers went about their business. The government, such as it was involved in financial matters at all, watched from a comfortable distance. Everything, they assured themselves, was under control. The system was sound. The fundamentals were strong. America's economy was the envy of the world. They believed. They assumed. They were catastrophically wrong. Act 2. The cracks appear. The scheme. The match that lit the fuse came from two men whose names deserve to live in infamy, F. Augustus Heinze and Charles W. Morse. Ambitious, reckless, and breathtakingly arrogant, they had spent years building a small empire of copper mines and banking interests, always operating on the edge, always one step ahead of disaster. In October 1907, they decided to roll the dice one final time. Their plan was audacious in its simplicity and staggering in its stupidity. They would corner the market in United Copper stock. They would buy up shares, drive the price higher, and force the short sellers, the speculators betting against the stock, to buy from them at inflated prices. It was a classic market manipulation, the kind of scheme that had made and broken fortunes for decades. Except it didn't work. The scheme collapsed almost immediately. There was more stock available than they had calculated. The price, instead of soaring, plummeted, and Heinze and Morse, instead of becoming legends, became cautionary tales. But the damage was done, because Heinze and Morse didn't just lose their own money. They had used their positions as bank directors to funnel depositor funds into the scheme. They had put other people's savings, other people's livelihoods on the line for their own greed. And when the scheme collapsed, it exposed something far more dangerous than two corrupt bankers. It exposed the fragility of the entire system. The first domino. The banks associated with Heinze and Morse came under immediate scrutiny. Depositors, reading the newspapers, learning of the failed scheme, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Was their money safe? Had their bank been involved? Could they trust the men managing their savings? The answers, when they came, were not reassuring, and so they did what any rational person would do in such circumstances. They went to the bank, and they demanded their money back. This is how bank runs begin, not with malice, not with conspiracy, with fear, with the simple, entirely logical decision that if there is even a chance your money might be at risk, you should get it out, now, before everyone else does. The problem, of course, is that banks don't keep all their deposits in cash, sitting in a vault. They lend it out. They invest it. They keep only a fraction on hand for daily withdrawals. This is called fractional reserve banking, and it works beautifully when everyone trusts the system. But when that trust breaks, When everyone shows up at once demanding their money back, the entire structure collapses like a house of cards. The first banks fell quickly. By mid-October, institutions that had been pillars of their communities for decades were shuttered, their doors locked, their depositors left standing on the sidewalk, clutching withdrawal slips that had become worthless pieces of paper. The contagion spreads. And here is where the real nightmare began. Because fear, once unleashed, doesn't stop at the guilty. It spreads. It metastasizes. Depositors at other banks, banks that had nothing to do with Heinze or Morse, began to wonder. If those banks could fail, what about ours? The trust companies, those high-flying, loosely regulated institutions, were the first to feel the pressure. The Knickerbocker Trust Company, one of the largest and most prestigious in New York, found itself facing a growing line of worried depositors. The line grew longer and longer, until it wrapped around the block, until it became a mob. On October 22nd, the Knickerbocker Trust tried to meet its obligations. For hours, tellers handed out cash to an endless stream of panicked customers. But by early afternoon, the vault was empty. The Knickerbocker, which had held over $60 million in deposits just days before, was forced to close its doors. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Knickerbocker could fall, any institution could fall. The panic, which had been confined to a few suspect banks, now spread across the entire financial district. Other trust companies saw runs, then commercial banks, then savings banks. The contagion was total, and it was accelerating. Washington's response. And where was the government in all this? Where was the mighty federal apparatus, the protector of the people, the defender of the nation's economic security? They were watching, helplessly. President Theodore Roosevelt was away, attending to other matters. The Treasury Secretary, George Cortelyou, rushed to New York and stared at the chaos with mounting horror. He had a small amount of funds available, perhaps $25 million, that could be deposited in banks to provide liquidity. He made those deposits. It accomplished almost nothing. It was like trying to fight a forest fire with a garden hose. The problem was structural, institutional. The federal government simply had no mechanism to respond to a financial crisis of this scale. There was no central bank to act as lender of last resort. There was no deposit insurance to calm depositors. There was no emergency lending facility to inject liquidity into frozen markets. Washington sent telegrams. They held meetings. They made statements of confidence. And none of it mattered, because they had no power, no tools, no authority to do what needed to be done. The invisible hand they had believed in so fervently was now an invisible fist, choking the life out of American commerce. Act 3. The day the system died. The liquidity crisis. By the last week of October, the crisis had moved beyond simple bank runs. It had metastasized into something far more dangerous, a complete freezing of the entire financial system. Banks that were still solvent, that still had money, refused to lend to each other. The interbank lending market, the circulatory system of modern finance, had suffered a massive heart attack. This meant that even healthy businesses, companies with strong balance sheets and solid prospects, couldn't get the short-term credit they needed for daily operations. They couldn't make payroll. They couldn't pay suppliers. The real economy, the world of factories and railroads and shops, was beginning to seize up for lack of the financial lubrication it needed to function. The stock market, that great barometer of American confidence, was in free fall. Share prices collapsed. Margin calls cascaded through the system. Brokers demanded immediate payment from clients who couldn't sell their stocks fast enough to meet the calls. It was a death spiral, and everyone could see it happening, but no one could stop it. The New York Stock Exchange itself was on the verge of shutting down. Not for a day, not for a week, potentially forever. Because without credit, without liquidity, the mechanics of trading simply couldn't function. The government's impotence. In Washington, The men in power finally understood the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't a correction. This wasn't a normal business cycle downturn. This was a systemic collapse, a complete failure of the nation's financial architecture. And they could do nothing. Treasury Secretary Cortelyou had exhausted his small reserve of funds. Congress wasn't in session and couldn't be recalled quickly enough to matter. President Roosevelt, watching from a distance, could offer moral support, but no practical help. The most powerful government on earth was discovering, in the most humiliating way possible, that it had built a financial system with no emergency brake, no backup plan, no mechanism to save itself when things went catastrophically wrong. The telegrams flying between Washington and New York grew increasingly desperate. Officials who days before had been confident in the self-regulating wisdom of markets were now begging, pleading for someone, anyone, to do something. And that's when someone asked the question that would change American history. Where is Morgan? The turning point J.P. Morgan had been watching. Of course he had been watching. You don't become the most powerful financier in the world by being oblivious to markets. He had seen the Heinz Morse scheme collapse. He had watched the first bank runs with professional interest. He had observed the contagion spread with the cool assessment of a man who had seen panics before, but he had not acted. Not yet, because Morgan didn't rush. He didn't panic. He watched, he calculated, and he moved only when the moment was right and the price was acceptable. By October 24th, the moment had arrived. The financial system of the United States was hours away from complete collapse. If the stock exchange closed, if the remaining trust companies fell, if the interbank lending system remained frozen, the entire American economy would grind to a halt. Millions would be thrown out of work. Businesses would fail by the thousands. The social and political consequences would be catastrophic. Someone needed to act. And the only person with the resources, the credibility, and the ruthless capability to do so was a 70-year-old private banker with no legal authority whatsoever. J.P. Morgan summoned his partners. He made phone calls. He sent messengers. And then he issued an invitation that was really a command. Come to my library. Now. Act 4. Morgan takes command. The private war room. The J.P. Morgan Library on 36th Street in Manhattan was not just a building. It was a statement. A Renaissance palazzo transplanted to New York, filled with priceless manuscripts, rare books, and artwork that would make museums weep with envy. It was Morgan's private sanctuary, his fortress of culture and refinement. And on the night of October 24th, 1907, it became the temporary central bank of the United States. Morgan sat in his study, the famous West Room, with its floor-to-ceiling bookcases and its massive desk. The room was thick with cigar smoke and tension. One by one, the most powerful men in American finance arrived. The presidents of the major banks, the heads of the surviving trust companies, men who, under normal circumstances, were fierce competitors, each jealously guarding their own interests. But these were not normal circumstances, and Morgan was not asking them to cooperate. He was telling them. The method Morgan's approach was systematic, ruthless, and brilliant. He demanded that each institution present its books, full disclosure, complete honesty, no hiding, no hedging, no protecting pride or reputation. He needed to know which institutions were solvent, which were savable, and which needed to be allowed to die. His team of accountants worked through the night, going over balance sheets, calculating asset values, assessing liabilities. Morgan himself sat at his desk, receiving reports, making decisions with a speed and confidence that was almost frightening. This trust company was solid. It would be saved. That one was rotten. It would be allowed to fail. This bank needed immediate liquidity. That one needed to be merged with a stronger institution. The decisions came rapid fire, each one potentially affecting thousands of lives, millions of dollars. and no one questioned him, because Morgan had something that the government lacked, something that no elected official could command in that moment. He had credibility. He had the trust of the markets. When J.P. Morgan said an institution was sound, people believed him. When he committed his own money to a rescue, others followed. He was functioning as a central bank, using his personal reputation as a form of currency more valuable than gold. The lock-in. But Morgan's most legendary moment came on the night of November 2nd. The crisis was reaching its climax. Several major trust companies were teetering on the edge of collapse. If they fell, they would take others with them. The entire house of cards would come down. Morgan had arranged a rescue plan. It required the major banks to contribute significant funds to a common pool that would be used to support the endangered institutions. He had cajoled, persuaded, and pressured. But as midnight approached, some of the bankers were wavering. They were worried about their own reserves. They wanted time to think, to consult with their boards, to protect their own institutions first. Morgan had no time for hesitation. He stood up from his desk, walked to the massive doors of his library, and locked them. Then he pocketed the key. The message was clear. No one was leaving until they committed. They would stay all night if necessary. They would stay for days. But they would not leave until the rescue was arranged. The bankers looked at each other, looked at the locked doors, and looked at the implacable, granite-faced old man with the key, and they agreed. By 4:45 in the morning, they had committed $25 million to the rescue fund. The crisis, for the moment, was contained. One private citizen, using nothing but force of will and the leverage of his reputation, had done what the entire United States government could not: saving the stock exchange. But Morgan wasn't finished. On November 4th, the New York Stock Exchange faced its final crisis. Desperate brokers needed $25 million in immediate credit to cover their positions and keep the exchange open. Without it, trading would stop, and that would trigger a complete psychological collapse of confidence. The banks, exhausted and wary, didn't want to provide the funds. Morgan called them together one more time. He gave them exactly 16 minutes to commit the money, not an hour, not even half an hour, 16 minutes. His reasoning was brutal in its clarity. If they hesitated, if they showed doubt, if they took time to deliberate, the market would smell weakness, and the panic would resume. They had to move fast, decisively, with overwhelming force. At the 14-minute mark, Morgan stood up. "This is the place to stop the trouble, then," he declared. The bankers, under the sheer force of his will, agreed. The money was committed. The stock exchange stayed open. The public reaction. The newspapers, which had been chronicling the panic with increasing hysteria, now turned their attention to Morgan. The savior of Wall Street, they called him, the one-man Federal Reserve. His portrait appeared on front pages across the nation. Crowds gathered outside his library, hoping for a glimpse of the man who had single-handedly prevented national catastrophe. But beneath the praise, there was unease. There were questions that people were beginning to ask, quietly at first, then with growing insistence. Is it right that one man, one unelected private citizen, should have so much power? Is it healthy for democracy that our nation's financial survival depends on the whims, the judgment, the personal decision-making of a single individual? What would happen if next time Morgan said no? What would happen if next time he wasn't there? Acte 5. The aftermath and the birth of the Fed. The backlash in the months following the panic of 1907. America's relationship with J.P. Morgan grew complicated. He was hailed as a hero, yes, but he was also increasingly viewed as a problem, a symptom of a deeper disease in the American system. The progressives, the reform movement that was gaining power across the nation, looked at Morgan's rescue and saw not triumph, but tyranny. They saw proof that power had become too concentrated, that wealth had corrupted the natural order of democracy, that one man should never again be allowed to hold such influence over the nation's fate. In 1912, Congress launched the Pujo Committee hearings, a sweeping investigation into the money trust, the concentration of financial power in the hands of a few institutions and individuals. Morgan was called to testify. For days, he sat in the witness chair, deflecting questions, defending his actions, insisting that his interventions had been necessary and proper. The hearings revealed what many had suspected. A small group of men, with Morgan at the center, controlled an astonishing percentage of American industry and finance. They sat on each other's boards. They coordinated their actions. They were, in effect, a private government operating parallel to the elected one. The American people were appalled, and they demanded change. The Aldrich Commission. Even before the Pujo hearings, the panic of 1907 had triggered a fundamental reassessment of American financial policy. In 1908, Congress established the National Monetary Commission, led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, to study the banking systems of Europe and develop recommendations for reform. What the Commission discovered was humbling. Every other major industrial nation had a central bank, an institution designed to provide stability, to act as lender of last resort, to prevent exactly the kind of panic that had paralyzed America in 1907. Britain had the Bank of England. France had the Banque de France. Germany had the Reichsbank. America had J.P. Morgan. And that, everyone now agreed, was not a sustainable system. The Commission's report was exhaustive, running to thousands of pages. Its conclusion was simple. America needed a central bank, not to control the economy, not to replace private banking, but to provide the basic stability that any modern financial system required. 1913, the Federal Reserve Act. The creation of the Federal Reserve was not smooth. The debate raged for years. Bankers wanted control. Populists wanted government oversight. Regional interests fought against New York dominance. Every faction had their concerns, their demands, their red lines. But the memory of 1907 was still fresh, the memory of waiting, helpless, while a private citizen decided the fate of the nation. That memory made compromise possible. In December 1913, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. It created a system of regional Federal Reserve banks, coordinated by a central board in Washington. It gave the government the tools to inject liquidity in a crisis, to regulate member banks, to act as the lender of last resort that the nation so desperately needed. The irony was inescapable. J.P. Morgan's very success in 1907, his demonstration of what concentrated private power could achieve, had created the political will to ensure that such power would never again be necessary. He had saved the system, and in doing so, he had made himself obsolete. Morgan's legacy. J.P. Morgan died in March 1913, just months before the Federal Reserve came into existence. He never saw the institution that his actions had made inevitable. Perhaps that was fitting. His world, the world of the great financial titans, who operated by personal reputation and private agreement, was passing. The 20th century would belong to institutions, to systems, to regulations and oversight. But his ghost haunted American finance for generations. Every debate about the proper role of government in markets, every argument about too-big-to-fail institutions, every crisis that required massive intervention, echoed back to that autumn in 1907. Because Morgan had revealed a truth that America has never quite known what to do with. Sometimes, in moments of genuine crisis, you need concentrated power. You need someone who can act decisively, without committees, without votes, without the slow grinding machinery of democratic process. But that power is dangerous. It's anti-democratic. It's the antithesis of everything America claims to stand for. And yet. When the next great crisis came in 1929 and then again in 2008, the question Americans asked was the same one they had asked in 1907. Where is our Morgan? The panic of 1907 was not just a financial crisis. It was a revelation about the nature of power, about the fragility of systems, about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the institutions we trust to protect us are not up to the task. For 1 week in October and November of 1907, the real capital of the United States was not Washington, D.C. It was a private library on 36th Street in Manhattan. The real president was not Theodore Roosevelt. It was a 70-year-old banker with a fierce glare and an iron will. J.P. Morgan became, for that brief, extraordinary moment, more powerful than the government he had been born to serve. He wielded that power well. He saved the nation from catastrophe. But he also proved, beyond any doubt, that a democracy that relies on private citizens to perform public functions is a democracy in crisis. The Federal Reserve that emerged from the ashes of 1907 was America's attempt to solve this problem, to create an institution that could provide the stability Morgan had provided, but through democratic accountability rather than personal authority. Whether that institution has lived up to its promise, whether it has solved the fundamental problem or simply created new ones, is a question that each generation must answer for itself. But the lesson of 1907 remains. Power concentrated in the hands of one person, no matter how capable, no matter how well-intentioned, is a dangerous thing. And a nation that needs such power to survive has built its system on a foundation far more fragile than it would like to believe. That's the story we should remember. Not just the heroism, though that was real. Not just the crisis and its resolution, though those were dramatic. But the deeper truth that in the autumn of 1907, America discovered that it had built a financial system that could only be saved by abandoning, temporarily, the very principles of democracy it claimed to hold sacred. And that is a lesson worth remembering.